Listen up, y'all. What I am about to walk you through is not gossip, it is not speculation, it is not another true crime rumor spinning in circles online. This is what actually happened inside a Los Angeles courtroom on day one of the David Anthony Burke preliminary hearing, and I promise you, by the time we get to the body cam footage the deputies played in open court, you are going to understand why every single reporter in that gallery walked out of the morning session looking a little bit smaller than when they walked in. Here is why this matters. The 21-year-old singer you know as D4vd is now sitting inches away from photographs of a 14-year-old girl's dismembered remains, and according to a reporter who watched him from 3 rows back, he looked bored. Not shocked. Not sorry. Bored. Buckle in, because we are just getting started. Real talk, this preliminary hearing is not a trial, and that distinction matters more than most of the internet realizes. There is no jury. There is no beyond a reasonable doubt standard. There is only a judge, a lower probable cause threshold, and a prosecution team that has decided to lay out its evidence in a very specific order, and the order itself tells you exactly what kind of case they believe they are building. They did not open with the crime scene. They did not open with the Tesla. They opened all the way back in September of 2024, with a welfare check, a bag of chips, and a young man in the Hollywood Hills laughing with sheriff's deputies while a 13-year-old girl named Celeste Rivas Hernandez was already missing from Lake Elsinore. Hold on to that image. It is going to matter. 10 months. That is how long it has been since a decomposing body was pulled from the front trunk of a Tesla registered to David Anthony Burke on a residential street in the Hollywood Hills. 10 months since a mechanic called authorities about the smell. 10 months of the internet piecing together fragments while the family of a murdered child waited for the machinery of the criminal justice system to finally start turning. And now, in a Los Angeles County courtroom with no cameras allowed and no audio equipment permitted anywhere near the proceedings, the machinery is finally moving. We had a reporter inside that gallery who watched every second of the morning session, and what she saw is worth every minute of your attention. What she wrote in her notes afterward is worth even more. And what she said to me on a rushed phone call during the lunch break is the reason I am talking to you right now instead of writing this up quietly the way most legal correspondents would. Let's back up a second, because the charges against David matter. He has been charged with first-degree murder with special circumstances. He has been charged with continuous sexual abuse of a child under the age of 14. He has been charged with unlawful mutilation of human remains. 3 felonies. 3 counts that, if proven at trial, describe a pattern of conduct so severe that the state of California is now openly considering whether to seek the ultimate criminal penalty available under its statutes. And earlier today, standing outside the courthouse during the lunch break, Los Angeles County District Attorney Nathan Hockman confirmed something that changes the entire calculus of this case. David Anthony Burke is death penalty eligible. The decision on whether the state will actually seek that penalty has not been made. But it is on the table. It is on the table right now. Now, the courtroom itself. The reporter who was our eyes and ears inside described the scene as a media circus, and that is not an exaggeration. Every major outlet had a crew camped outside the courthouse. Producers were fighting for gallery seats. Helicopters were overhead. Legal analysts were doing hits from the sidewalk in front of the entrance while sheriff's personnel routed traffic around the block. And 3 rows in front of that reporter, in the second row of the public gallery, sat Celeste's mother and father. They walked in together. They sat down together. And when the prosecution began to project photographs onto the courtroom screen, they leaned into each other in a way that no parent should ever have to lean into another human being. The reporter could not see their faces. She could only see the backs of their heads bowing lower and lower as the images kept coming. That, folks, tells you everything. Here is what happened when David was brought in. There was a whispered back and forth at counsel table about whether the defendant should be shackled. Without a jury present there is no argument that visible restraints would prejudice a fact finder, and yet the defense pushed the issue anyway. Then he sat down. And here is the detail that has been echoing in my head since the reporter walked me through her notes. She said he spoke clearly. He said, "Yes, Your Honor," when the judge went over the rules of the preliminary hearing. His voice was steady. His posture was relaxed. And then, when the prosecution began presenting its evidence, David Anthony Burke rested his face between his hands and looked bored. That is her word. Bored. In a room where a 14-year-old girl's parents were bracing themselves for the worst thing a parent can ever be forced to see, the man accused of putting them in that room was resting his chin in his palms like a bored student in a lecture hall. And then the photographs came up. Not descriptions. Not summaries. Actual photographs. Up until this morning, reporters covering this case had only been given verbal descriptions of what was found in that Tesla. What the prosecution projected onto the courtroom screen today changed that forever. Our reporter described an audible intake of breath across the gallery. The typing stopped. The shuffling of notebooks stopped. The room went silent. She said you could see a head and a torso inside an unzipped cadaver bag in the front trunk. You could see limbs, arms and legs, chopped and placed inside a second bag, a black garbage bag with blue handles. And through all of it, David just stared at the screen. Blinking. No visible reaction. Not one. Until one photograph broke through. And this is the moment that everyone in that courtroom is going to remember for the rest of their lives. The prosecution pulled up a side-by-side. Two hands. The left hand of the victim, with two fingers missing, the ring finger and the pinky. And the right hand, with the index finger extended just slightly, and a small tattoo inked across the skin. Two letters. SH. That is how they identified her. A tattoo she had gotten as a child. Our reporter said David leaned forward just slightly when that image came up. Still no expression on his face. But he leaned in. Read into that whatever you want. Now let's talk about the body cam footage, because this is where the prosecution's strategy becomes surgical. They opened the case not with the corpse, but with a routine welfare check from September of 2024, more than a year before Celeste's remains were ever discovered. A senior deputy from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department was called to the stand. He and his partner had been dispatched to a rental property in the Hollywood Hills, a house registered in the name of an assistant of David's, a man named Robert Morgan Roth. The deputies were following up on a missing persons report filed by Celeste's father, Jesus Rivas, out of Riverside County. And what the deputy's body cam captured that day, roughly 10 minutes of it, was played in open court this morning. Here is what our reporter saw. She said the first thing she noticed was David's demeanor. He was disarmingly charming. He let the deputies in without hesitation. He was laughing. He was joking. He was eating what looked like a bag of chips. He had something wrapped around his hair. He was chilling at home. He looked like any 20-year-old surprised by a wellness check on a random Tuesday. At one point in the recording, he offered the deputies alcohol, telling them he had some in the fridge, and the deputy on camera can be heard politely declining, saying that was not what they were there for. They were there for a missing girl from Lake Elsinore. And this is where the conversation caught on that body cam becomes evidence the defense is going to have to answer for at trial. David told the deputies, on camera, that Celeste had told him she was 18 years old. The deputy then informed him, on camera, that Celeste was in fact 13. And then the deputy asked him a question that our reporter said is absolutely going to resurface during cross-examination if this case reaches a jury. The deputy asked, does she look 13? That question, that answer, that entire exchange, is now hard evidence. It is on the record. It is on tape. And the prosecution led with it for a reason. The reason is this. The state is not just trying to prove that David killed Celeste. The state is trying to prove that David was in a continuous sexual relationship with a child, that he lied to law enforcement about the nature of that relationship, and that he later killed her to keep her silent. Everything else, the Tesla, the dismemberment, the cover-up, flows from that foundational allegation. And the body cam is where they plant it. The whisper network in that courthouse hallway is loud right now, and here is what they are whispering. The defense has already begun homing in on David's cooperation during that welfare check. They are pointing to his willingness to let deputies inside. They are pointing to his claim that he believed Celeste was 18. They are building a narrative of a young man who was misled, who cooperated fully, who had nothing to hide. The prosecution's counter is going to be brutal. The prosecution is going to argue that David was lying about the last time he saw her, lying about the nature of their relationship, lying about what he knew. The prosecution is going to argue that this relationship allegedly began when Celeste was as young as 11, that David and Celeste met in 2022, that a sexual relationship allegedly followed in 2023, And that United Airlines flight records already recovered by investigators show David purchased tickets for himself and Celeste for trips from Los Angeles to Texas and from Los Angeles to London. Read that sentence again. A grown man buying international flights for a 13-year-old girl. Now, here is where it gets darker, and I need you to sit with this. The second witness called to the stand this morning was Detective Joshua Byers of the Los Angeles Police Department Robbery and Homicide Division. This is the lead investigator on the Celeste Rivas Hernandez homicide, and he is the man who was called to the scene the day the Tesla was found. His testimony was interrupted by the lunch break, but before the judge gavelled the morning to a close, Detective Byers had already begun walking the court through what he saw when he arrived at that Tesla, what he found inside, and what he did next. And courtroom-adjacent sources are describing his testimony as absolutely shocking. Not because a homicide detective doing his job is shocking. Because the specific facts he was describing were the kind of facts that stop a room. He described being called by dispatch after the discovery of 2 cadaver-adjacent bags in the front trunk of the vehicle. He described the level of decomposition. He described the absence of identifiable facial features. He described how he requested contact information from Celeste's father, Jesus Rivas, through a Spanish-language interpreter, so that the medical examiner could reach out to the family dentist and obtain dental records, because dental records were the only remaining pathway to positive identification. That is what this case has been reduced to. A tattoo on an index finger. A dental chart. A father speaking to a homicide detective through a translator about his missing daughter. Let that live in you for a minute. Let it sit there. Let it be uncomfortable. Because if the state's theory is even close to the truth, this is what a child superstar in the modern music industry is capable of hiding behind a smile and a fresh single on the streaming charts. And there is more. Detective Byers testified that a search warrant was executed at the rental property where David had been staying. Investigators recovered multiple devices. Computer towers. Phones. Digital hardware that has already been linked forensically back to the Tesla, and to a timeline of Tesla driving activity that continued well after Celeste's estimated time of death. But the piece of evidence that stopped the room, according to the reporter in the gallery, was an item recovered from that rental property that had not previously been reported publicly. An unopened burn box. A device the size of a small oven, designed to incinerate materials down to nothing. The prosecution has not yet alleged that this box was used on Celeste's remains. There is no forensic finding on the record to that effect. But the prosecution introduced it into the evidence timeline for a reason. And any reasonable observer sitting in that gallery understood the reason. The prosecution is going to argue that this was preparation. That someone in that house was preparing to make a body disappear. That is not gossip. That is the strategic inference the state is asking the court to draw from an unopened box. Now let's step outside the courtroom for a moment, because during the lunch break, District Attorney Nathan Hockman held a press conference on the courthouse steps, and what he said publicly matters as much as what happened privately in the gallery. Hockman confirmed that the preliminary hearing is expected to last 3 to 5 days. He confirmed that the prosecution intends to call more than 10 witnesses, including officers, coroner testimony, and civilian witnesses. He confirmed that at this stage, the prosecution is permitted to rely on hearsay and other forms of evidence that would not be admissible at trial, because probable cause is a much lower bar than beyond a reasonable doubt. And then he confirmed the thing that everyone had been waiting to hear. David Anthony Burke faces a maximum sentence of life without the possibility of parole. He is death penalty eligible. And the decision on whether the state will seek that penalty has not yet been made. Here is what that means practically. There is a moratorium on executions in California. Even if the state seeks the death penalty and even if a jury imposes it, no one is being executed in this state anytime soon. But the mere presence of the death penalty on the table changes the entire dynamic of this case. It changes what the defense is willing to negotiate. It changes what the prosecution is willing to offer. It creates the possibility, and this is a possibility the reporters covering this case are already quietly comparing notes about, that at some point between now and trial, David Anthony Burke's defense team may approach the DA's office and ask whether a plea to life without parole, in exchange for the state removing the death penalty from consideration, is on the table. That conversation may already be happening. We do not know. But it is the conversation that the death penalty announcement makes possible, and it is the conversation the district attorney absolutely knew he was inviting when he stepped up to that microphone this afternoon. And here is the piece that I want everyone watching this to sit with, because it is the piece that no amount of legal analysis can quite capture. During the 15-minute mid-morning recess, our reporter walked into the ladies' room of the courthouse, and she encountered Celeste's mother. She said the mother's eyes were red. She said there were no words. She said that the entire media presence, every helicopter, every satellite truck, every producer, every camera crew, is not really here for David. It is here for Celeste. It is here for a 14-year-old girl whose life was ended before she was old enough to vote, old enough to drive, old enough to legally consent to anything the state now alleges was done to her. The reporter said the mother was scooting closer to the father as those courtroom photographs came up. A staff member from the district attorney's office was seated beside the mother, and at one point during the presentation of the dismemberment images, that staff member wrapped her arm around the mother's shoulders. That is the picture. That is what justice looks like on day one. A mother being held together by a stranger from the prosecutor's office while the state introduces photographs of what remains of her child. David sat through all of that. Blinking. Resting his face in his hands. Looking, in the reporter's own words, bored. If the prosecution's theory is correct, this is the man who allegedly began a sexual relationship with a girl when she was 11 or 12, who allegedly killed her to keep her from speaking, who allegedly dismembered her body and left it inside the front trunk of his own vehicle on a residential street in the Hollywood Hills. That is the theory. It is not proven yet. He has entered a plea of not guilty. He is presumed innocent unless the state proves otherwise. That is not a technicality. That is a foundational protection built into the American legal system, and it exists precisely because the state must be forced to prove its case, no matter how heavy the accusation, no matter how ugly the evidence, no matter how much the internet has already decided. But the state's opening act, on day one of the preliminary hearing, was to lay out a chronological narrative that begins with a young man laughing with sheriff's deputies over a bag of chips in September of 2024, and ends with a black garbage bag with blue handles in the front trunk of a Tesla in September of 2025. 1 year. That is the arc the prosecution is asking the court to see. The remainder of this preliminary hearing is going to be a slow, methodical presentation of that arc. Detective Byers will return to the stand and finish walking the court through the search of the Hollywood Hills rental. He will describe the recovery of the devices. He will describe the forensic linkage between the digital evidence and the Tesla's driving history. He will likely describe the United Airlines flight records in more detail. He will likely testify to communications between David and Celeste that investigators have recovered from the recovered phones. And at some point during the 3 to 5 day window of this hearing, coroner testimony is going to be introduced, and that testimony is going to be the hardest part of all of this. The court is going to hear, in clinical detail, what was done to a 14-year-old girl's body. The medical examiner is going to walk the court through the process of decomposition, the process of dismemberment, the process of positive identification. Reporters in that gallery are already bracing for it. And when it comes, the tone of the coverage of this case is going to shift again. I want to say one more thing before we close this out, because it is the thing that keeps coming back to me. The defense's early strategy, based on what our reporter watched this morning, appears to be built around the idea that David was cooperative with law enforcement, that he believed Celeste was of legal age, and that any relationship between them was not what the state is now alleging. That strategy is going to collide, hard, with the body cam. Because the body cam captured a moment in which a sheriff's deputy asked David directly whether Celeste looked 13. And in the days and weeks to come, jurors, and all of us, are going to be forced to think very carefully about what a reasonable adult in David's position should have understood, should have asked, should have done. That question is the fulcrum on which this entire prosecution turns. That question is what the state has been building toward from the very first witness this morning. And let me leave you with one more layer, because this is the part that most of the surface-level coverage is going to miss. The prosecution's decision to begin its case with the welfare check from 2024, rather than with the discovery of the Tesla in 2025, is not a scheduling accident. It is a rhetorical choice. It is a storytelling choice. The prosecution is telling the court and telling the public that this case is not about a single terrible moment in a Hollywood Hills driveway. It is about a pattern that stretches back years, a pattern of an adult man allegedly grooming, allegedly transporting, allegedly hiding, and ultimately allegedly killing a child whose parents had already reported her missing to law enforcement long before her remains were found. That is a much harder case to defend. And that is exactly why the state built it in that order. So here is where I leave you. We are going to be back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, walking you through every session of this preliminary hearing as it unfolds. We are going to have our reporter back in that gallery, watching every witness, tracking every exhibit, listening for every off-mic murmur from the defense table. And when the judge finally issues her ruling on whether David Anthony Burke will be held to answer on all 3 felony counts, we will be here to walk you through that too. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe the prosecution will be able to prove all 3 counts beyond a reasonable doubt when this eventually goes to trial? Or do you think the defense's cooperation and mistaken age theory is going to give this jury enough reasonable doubt to hang on to? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because folks, this case is far from over, and the world is watching. Stay with us. We are just getting started.